Welcome to this edition of the Head to Head Podcast. I'm your host, Kim McKinney. This is episode number 96 of the podcast. In this edition of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about Texans head coach and general manager Bill O'Brien. This guy has easily become the most hated figure in all of football this offseason. He's been ridiculed. He's been said he should be fired for his decision making. A bunch of people have made it their quest in life to make fun of Bill O'Brien for what he has done since becoming the general manager of the Houston Texans. He has been the head coach for a while, but just recently he was named general manager, and so many of the popular sports anchors and analysts have made fun of Bill O'Brien and his decision making. Fans of the Houston Texans have also mocked him. I thought it would be interesting if I put Bill O'Brien on trial. I will be making a case for and against Bill O'Brien, and then I will be making my decision. So let's start. Let's make the case against Bill O'Brien. Why are people so mad? First of all, as a general manager, he traded away Deandre Hopkins, a top 10 receiver in football, and arguably the best receiver in franchise history. I mean, there is Andre Johnson, but I think Deandre Hopkins would win that contest for most people. And it's not just that he traded away DeAndre Hopkins, a fan favorite, also one of the best receivers in football. It's what he got back in return. David Johnson and a second-round draft pick and 2 fourth-round draft picks when Stephon Diggs was able to be traded by the Vikings for a first-round draft pick. So the argument against him was that he wasn't getting fair value for what most people believe is a top 10 to 5 receiver in all of football. That you were not able to get a first-round draft pick for DeAndre Hopkins is unforgivable for most people. He's in his prime. He's 27 years old. He catches 100 balls in his sleep. By most people's metrics, you should have gotten way more than David Johnson, an aging running back with a bad contract, a second rounder, and 2 fourth-round draft picks. And if it's true that Bill O'Brien traded away DeAndre Hopkins because he didn't like his character, then that is truly ridiculous to trade away with so much talent because you think he's a menace off the field or whatever's going on there. There's a strange situation that happened between Bill O'Brien and DeAndre Hopkins. People were mad when he traded Jadeveon Clowney, and again, it didn't seem like he got fair value for what he was giving up in Jadeveon Clowney. So he gave away DeAndre Hopkins, one of their best offensive weapon, and Jadeveon Clowney, arguably their second best defensive player, not named J.J. Watt. And to replace DeAndre Hopkins, Bill O'Brien brings in Brandin Cooks, a wide receiver who is talented and can catch a lot of footballs, but has had concussion issues and is by most people's standards past his prime. So you get rid of DeAndre Hopkins and you bring in David Johnson, an aging, injury-riddled running back, and you bring in Brandin Cooks, a wide receiver who's been on 4 different teams now. Other issue I personally have for Bill O'Brien is he's supposed to be an offensive guy. I mean, he was the offensive coordinator for the New England Patriots. He became the head coach of Penn State. Then he gets a job with the Texans, and he's supposed to be an offensive-minded guy. And for my biggest argument against him is since he's gone there, they have been a much better defensive team than offensive team. I mean, the team has had really good defenders like Jonathan Joseph, J.J. Watt, and of course, Jadeveon Clowney. I mean, those are the type of guys that have been the standouts during the Bill O'Brien era. On offense, he's had Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins. He has not developed a great offense since becoming the head coach of the Houston Texans. They have not been like the Chiefs. They have not been like the Patriots. They are not an efficient offense. Last year, they did make good strides offensively. Deshaun Watson had his best year as quarterback. But overall, their team, to me, have not hit their offensive ceiling like they should. If your head coach is a guy you hired because of his offensive prowess. I mean, this is a guy, again, offensive coordinator of the New England Patriots. I think they expected to be a better offensive football team. I mean, he's not Kyle Shanahan. He's obviously not Andy Reid. He might not even be Frank Reich when it comes to offensive coaches. Last season, the Houston Texans averaged 23.6 points per game. That was 14th out of 32 in the National Football League. Bill O'Brien has not shined on the side of the football that you thought he would. He was supposed to be an offensive-minded coach. I mean, early on in his coaching career, you could defend him because he had Brian Hoyer throwing throwing interception in playoff games, and Ryan Mallett. Those were his options at quarterback. But now Deshaun Watson has fallen into his lap, and he hasn't developed that offense to become one of the best units in football. That's where they need to be. That's where Bill O'Brien needs to improve. Another thing is, he did blow a 24-point playoff lead to the Kansas City Chiefs in the second round of the playoffs. Yes, it was Pat Mahomes. Yes, it was to the Super Bowl winning team. They went on to win the Super Bowl, but that doesn't matter. You cannot blow big games like that. For you to blow a 24-point lead against the Kansas City Chiefs, Andy Reid and Pat Mahomes, that is just damaging towards Bill O'Brien's career as a head coach. He has Deshaun Watson. He's supposed to be an offensive guy, and to lose to Andy Reid and Pat Mahomes in that fashion is terrible. And I think the thing that says the most about Bill O'Brien is that nobody was surprised that he blew that lead. Nobody was like, oh yeah, I'm so shocked that Bill O'Brien and the Houston Texans blew a 24-point playoff lead. We were all like, yeah, that's what's supposed to happen because Pat Mahomes and Andy Reid are that much better. And it should not be that case. Bill O'Brien should be the kind of coach who can win big games, and Deshaun Watson is that type of quarterback that can win big games, and they didn't. Another thing I don't like is the fact that he is the general manager of the Houston Texans, because that never works. Look at when the Eagles gave all the power to Chip Kelly. How did that work out? Not well. Adam Gase was given power by the Jets. I just feel like a coach should be the coach and a general manager should be the general manager. Even Bill Belichick makes too many mistakes as a general manager. Somebody else should be the head of the front office, not Bill O'Brien. Because by the Texans making Bill O'Brien the coach and the general manager, they are opening him up for this criticism. The reason we are blaming Bill O'Brien is because we now believe he makes every single decision for the Houston Texans. So when he blows that 24-point lead, we'll criticize him. When he trades away DeAndre Hopkins and Jadeveon Clowney, we'll criticize him. He is the face of that organization. The Houston Texans are as much to blame as Bill O'Brien is for giving him that much power over their football team. The biggest mistake Bill O'Brien is making is that he might be driving away his star quarterback in Deshaun Watson. If Deshaun Watson is furious that he's lost DeAndre Hopkins, which he probably is, and if the Houston Texans have a bad regular season this year and his stats don't look the same and he doesn't have that star wide receiver, then Deshaun Watson will most likely not want to remain a member of the Houston Texans. And whose fault will that be? Bill O'Brien. He will be looked at as the guy who drove away a top 10 quarterback. You can lose Clowney, you can lose DeAndre Hopkins, but if you lose Deshaun Watson, you lose the Houston Texans. I do not think that if Bill O'Brien loses Deshaun Watson, he is going to be given another opportunity to develop another quarterback. That will be the coffin and the nail for O'Brien, is if he loses Deshaun Watson. I believe he would lose his job at that point. His one saving grace is if Deshaun Watson has a better season without Hopkins, because I have seen that in the past. I mean, the Patriots did get rid of Randy Moss, and then Tom Brady was able to find new weapons in Wes Welker, Rob Gronkowski, Aaron Hernandez, Julian Edelman. I mean, Tom Brady was able to get past the fact that he no longer had a wide receiver. But the biggest difference is Tom Brady won Super Bowls before Randy Moss was there, and he was used to playing without a star receiver. Deshaun Watson has never played a football game without the safety net that is DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, you hope Will Fuller and Brandin Cooks, the combination of the two, fill the void left by Hopkins, but most people are definitely not banking on that to happen. In the end, it doesn't matter what I feel about Bill O'Brien, what DeAndre Hopkins feels about Bill O'Brien, what the media feels about Bill O'Brien. I think this all comes down to how does Deshaun Watson at this moment feel about Bill O'Brien. Next year will be very telling. That's my case against Bill O'Brien. Here's my case for him. He is 52-44 as the head coach of the Houston Texans. He's been to the postseason 4 times, and he is definitively, I think, the best coach of the Bill Belichick coaching tree. He's better than Eric Mangini, Romeo Crennel, Josh McDaniels, and Matt Patricia. He has had by far the most success out of those other coaches. He keeps his teams competitive. He's went 9-7 in each of his first 3 seasons. I mean, he's not a bad coach. He can win football games. He hasn't had the most talented of rosters. And before Deshaun Watson got there, the players he had playing the quarterback position were subpar. They were Ryan Mallett, Brian Hoyer, and Brock Osweiler, a player that the Houston Texans paid heavily to become their franchise quarterback, and he did not. O'Brien was still able to get to the postseason with those 3 players playing the quarterback position. There are coaches with far better quarterbacks that routinely miss the playoffs. I don't think under Bill O'Brien that the Texans have ever been Super Bowl contenders per se, but I do think they've been competitive enough for where they should be as an organization, talent-wise. I don't think he's underachieved as the head coach of the Houston Texans. And yes, people are mad he traded away DeAndre Hopkins and Jadeveon Clowney. But I do think you can look at it and say that DeAndre Hopkins and Jadeveon Clowney want a lot of money. That definitely affected their trade market. Stephon Diggs is under a nice contract for the next few seasons, so that's why the Buffalo Bills definitely wanted to trade for Stephon Diggs. And probably the reason that a team like the Bills did not want to trade for DeAndre Hopkins because he was looking somewhere in the window of $85 to $100 million. That's not the type of money the Buffalo Bills want to be paying to a wide receiver. So why not instead trade for Stephon Diggs, who has a more team-friendly contract and not a guy who's looking for a next big money deal contract? DeAndre Hopkins has never been paid like a top-tier receiver that he is, and he's looking for a huge payday. The Cardinals have a young quarterback in Kyler Murray, so it makes sense for them to trade for DeAndre Hopkins, but in the same deal, they don't want to give a first-round draft pick if they know they probably have to invest a lot of money into DeAndre Hopkins, which they probably will. So they took advantage of the fact that he wanted all that money and they didn't have to give up a first round draft pick to get him. I know it looks bad on paper, but it kind of makes sense. And the Cardinals have other running backs so they can move on from David Johnson. Plus, again, he has a big contract. So that part, I really don't understand why the Houston Texans would want to take on that contract. But I do understand the fact why they would want David Johnson. When healthy, David Johnson is one of the best running backs. When healthy, he is. I mean, fantasy guys went crazy for David Johnson. He has really great stats. Also, he is kind of a rental. I mean, David Johnson has one more year left on his contract. It is $10.2 million, which is a lot for a running back. But why not take a rental out of David Johnson, see if you can still compete? You don't want to pay DeAndre Hopkins top-tier wide receiver money. That's why they moved on from DeAndre Hopkins. And whether or not you agree with that or not, that's another discussion. But in defense of Bill O'Brien, he was not going to get a first-round draft pick for a guy who wants to be the highest paid wide receiver in football. I think the decision also has to come down to the fact that Deshaun Watson is going to be a free agent soon, and they would rather pay him than pay Hopkins, and they don't want to pay both of them. But the real argument against is if he loses Deshaun Watson and he loses DeAndre Hopkins, then it's a phenomenal failure. But if trading away DeAndre Hopkins lets him keep Deshaun Watson and it all works out, then this move made sense. Down the line, if they keep DeAndre Hopkins, this move might make a lot more sense. I think another thing that really frustrates me is people pretend like Bill O'Brien is breaking up the 1927 Yankees. Yes, he got rid of DeAndre Hopkins, who is a great receiver, but what did it really win him? The last 2 seasons, the Texans have been 10-6 and 11-5, and they blew a 24-point lead to the Kansas City Chiefs. So why are we blaming Bill O'Brien for trying to mix things up and win a different way? It's not like he's coming off Super Bowl wins here. He's probably on the hot seat, so he was desperate to make some moves. He knew he probably had to trade DeAndre Hopkins, but he was able to get David Johnson and Brandin Cooks as insurance if he loses Hopkins, which he did. So now he has Cooks. Again, Cooks is really good when healthy. David Johnson, again, it's a one-year rental. If it works out, it could be a phenomenal get for the Houston Texans. They can still be competitive next season, and Bill O'Brien probably needs them to be competitive to keep his job. But don't act like Bill O'Brien is breaking up a great football team here, because he's not. He's an easy target because he's the head coach and the general managers, but plenty of teams trade away their star players because they don't want to pay him. If the Texans were able to keep that 24-point lead and beat the Kansas City Chiefs and maybe make a trip to the Super Bowl, then if they traded DeAndre Hopkins after that, I would be furious. But they did blow a 24-point lead against the Kansas City Chiefs. So maybe things needed to change. Maybe doing the same thing over and over again is maddening. And this whole Deshaun Watson to DeAndre Hopkins being our only offense, maybe that was never going to truly work out. So he's trying something different. Here's who the Houston Texans have at the wide receiver position for next season: Brandin Cooks, Randall Cobb, Will Fuller, and Kenny Stills. That's a pretty decent group of wide receivers right there. That's a good nucleus core to go along with Deshaun Watson. Each of those guys could catch 60 to 80 footballs. And maybe having a group of good receivers is better sometimes than having one guy that you absolutely lean on every single moment of a football game. That's what the Houston Texans have done basically the past 6 years with DeAndre Hopkins, and it hasn't gotten them to that Super Bowl level that Bill O'Brien probably needs to get to if he's going to keep his job. So he said to himself, I had to get rid of this guy. I don't want to pay him a massive amount of money. I need to keep Deshaun Watson, but I still need to be a good football team. So I'll go out and I'll get weapons like Cooks, like Cobb, like Stills, and we'll have a group of receivers instead of one star receiver that we absolutely need to win football games. Again, it's a different direction. It might not work, but I don't hate him for trying it. And maybe Will Fuller takes that next step and becomes the best receiver on the team. I mean, you still got Cooks, you still got Kenny Stills, and you have Randall Cobb, who had a pretty good season with the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, it was a bounce back season. Randall Cobb, a pretty good veteran receiver to have to go along with a quarterback like Deshaun Watson. I mean, have these guys that can catch 60 to 80 balls and see if you can win some football games and try to replace DeAndre Hopkins, a guy who could easily catch 100 balls. I think it's a false narrative that's being told that Bill O'Brien is trying to replace DeAndre Hopkins with Brandin Cooks. I think that's ridiculous. I think Bill O'Brien knows that's not what he's doing. He has a group of receivers. He still has Will Fuller, who will probably end up being the best receiver on the team. He brought in Randall Cobb. He traded for Kenny Stills last season, who's a decent veteran receiver. He is not replacing a top 10 receiver in DeAndre Hopkins with Brandin Cooks. No, he's replacing him by a group of veteran receivers by committee. And I think that's the way to go if you got to get rid of DeAndre Hopkins, which it seems like they had to do because they weren't going to pay him that exorbitant amount of money that he's looking for. Okay, now that I've made the case for and against Bill O'Brien, here's my verdict. Yes, some questionable moves have been made, and Brandin Cooks and David Johnson are huge gambles, but let it play out on the field. If it doesn't work out, Bill O'Brien will lose his job, but if it does work out, he will have proved us all wrong. I mean, that's the fun in these kind of moves. We can question them, and we can for days and weeks say, Bill O'Brien, you're a madman. What are you doing? But the fun in sports is experiencing what happens on the field and seeing how his master plan all works out. And if it blows up in his face, yes, you'll all be right. You'll love it. You'll enjoy it. You'll love every second of it. But let's say the Houston Texans make that next step and win 12, 13, or even 14 games, and Deshaun Watson has his best season ever, and the Houston Texans make a trip to the AFC title game and have a chance to make the Super Bowl, then all those moves, the trading of Hopkins, the tumultuous offseason that he's been through, they'll all have been worth it, and Bill O'Brien will have saved his job. I just think there's too much talking going on about that. The fun of this will see what happens on the field with the Houston Texans. And because of the moves that have been made and because of the chatter that's being built around Bill O'Brien, this upcoming season will be the biggest season of his coaching career. And I, for one, am kind of rooting for him because all day long on ESPN and all these channels, they are ridiculing Bill O'Brien. Let it play out on the field, and let's finally prove once and for all if Bill O'Brien is a good coach and a good general manager. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Head Dad Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McKinney. There'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and iTunes, so please rate, review, and subscribe.